First, I'd like to ask how much time do I have? Because I can really be short if I need to be.
20 minutes.
3 minutes?
20.
Oh, 20 minutes.
Yeah, we're
Oh,
right on schedule.
oh, okay, great. Well, as you know, my name is Sharon Lewis, and I would like to talk to you about environmental racism, which is considered a public health emergency. But before I start talking about that, I'd like for you to know that I'm going to be talking from the perspective of the Black experience, descendants of slaves, because Black people were the first and hardest hit by structural, systemic, and institutional racism, otherwise known as white supremacy. You know, all my life, I've been led to believe that a lot of the health conditions that plague African Americans were hereditary. In fact, I often hear people say, you know, heart disease runs in my family, diabetes runs in my family, a particular type of cancer runs in my family. And I I would respond by saying, well, maybe your family has the same occupation. I never in a million years would I even expect or even assume that these illnesses were due to where we lived, where we worked, where we played, and where we worshiped. From coast to coast, I often wondered why everywhere I went, all the major cities in the United States looked the same and why we all have the same diseases. Sometimes, if I went someplace and closed my eyes, I'd think I was in one city and I'm actually in another. That's just how much they looked alike. However, when I found out the reason why they all looked alike, and when I found out the reason why African Americans have the same diseases, I cried for 2 days. Now, let me start from the beginning. After slavery, there was a great migration of Black people leaving the South in droves. During the Reconstruction period, Blacks flourished. But as soon as the US troops left the South, the whites decided that they wanted to maintain control. They stopped Blacks from voting. They eliminated those who made it to Congress and those who became political figures. They put hot and heavy demands on them that would almost make it seem like they were back into slavery with Black codes, which were as close to slavery as you could possibly get, with the penal system whereby if you didn't have a job or you didn't have a place to live, they could snatch you off the streets at any moment and make you work for the penal system in jail. Then we, of course, had Jim Crow, which was the government sanctioned segregation, which permeated every life, every aspect of African American life. So after World War I and World War II, right up through the 1960s, African Americans left the South in droves because they were pushed by terror. Terror from the Ku Klux Klan, terror from lynchings, the penal system, Jim Crow, disenfranchisement, slavery by any other name. The white supremacists wanted to maintain status quo, but they were pulled by economic and political opportunities, pulled by peace, pulled by freedom from rape, pulled by freedom, period, hoping that they were in a promised land where they wouldn't have to experience all this terror. However, they soon found out that the North was just as much a hell as the South was. In fact, they found out they only moved north of slavery, east of slavery, and west of slavery because there were no jobs available for them, no decent housing available for them. They could not vote. There was no peace. There was constant terror. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but there was so much terror in the North that the NAACP in 1909 was founded as a result of lynching in Springfield, Illinois, not Montgomery, Alabama, Springfield, Illinois. That's just how bad it was. And no jobs meant no health care. Substandard housing meant poor health outcomes. Lead poisoning was the boogeyman. Lead poisoning was the monster under the bed because everywhere African Americans went, they were exposed to lead poisoning. Now, I'd like to define environmental racism and what that is. Environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or decisions that deliberately target communities of color for undesirable land uses, which give rise to adverse living conditions as well as adverse health conditions. All throughout America, from coast to coast, north, south, east, west, it was America first. And this visual you need, I'm going to describe it to you because I have a visual where you have the Klansmen walking on the street in New York City, and they're carrying a banner that says America First. Now, we've recently been hearing that America First for the last 4 years. I wonder where that came from. And then the people were subjected to government sanctioned redlining, racial covenants, which uh, were actual deeds on people's houses, which prevented white people from selling or renting or allowing Black people to spend the night in their homes unless they were a part of the help. The deeds actually stated that no Blacks were allowed to buy this house. And if they were, then if a white person actually sold a house to a Black person, then they would be subject to penalties of the law, whatever that may be, depending on the state. There was massive discrimination where everywhere you went, you were met with pushback. The federal government uh, told developers that if you rented or sold to Black people, we're not going to lend you the money to build this project. The 14th Amendment, which was the Amendment of Protection, was extremely violated, frequently violated, and ignored. And the Supreme Court decided that it was okay to discriminate in violation of the 14th Amendment. Then there was restrictive zoning, which did nothing but push Black people into undesirable areas and unhealthy conditions. The only people who would rent to them were people where the rents were triple what it was supposed to be. So you had to double and triple up with different families just to survive or to pay your rent. And what a lot of people don't understand, and what you think that Black people created this mess, Black people did not create ghettos and they did not create slums. They occupied the slums and ghettos that were vacated by the Europeans. So please understand that. Now, the next graphic is a picture of street signs. One says, do not enter, street closed, and detour. And these are universal signs in the United States, so you can imagine what they look like. And basically, these were the visuals that Blacks were met with every time they tried to find decent housing. There were all kinds of roadblocks and barricades and barriers that prevented them from going there. And there were some brave Black people who decided to move into white neighborhoods, but lots of them didn't stay very long because their houses were bombed. There was mob terror where thousands of people would surround the house and burn the house down, burn them out, call them all kinds of names. It was hell. And this sort of mentality carried on throughout history because a lot of African Americans were afraid to go into the suburbs. Even those who were allowed by some stroke of luck to buy a house, they were afraid to move in because they knew about the situations that were others faced, and they didn't want to go through that. You know, they'd been through that in the South, and they didn't want to do that again. And my family in particular, my parents were lucky enough to both be entrepreneurs, and we were lucky enough to grow up having everything we wanted. And the first time I ever saw my father cry was when they wanted to buy a $40,000 house in Windsor, Connecticut, and they had $20,000 to put down. Who puts 50% down? And they were still denied. And both my parents said, we're not going to go through this. This is just the beginning. So it was a lot of grief, and I really praise all those folks who went through it. In fact, I remember the first Black family who moved into Bloomfield was the Myers family. And one of the politicians, I think his name was Ned Cole, he bought the house for them. It had a restrictive covenant on it, and he sold it to them. And I don't know what repercussions he had, but I do know that he didn't stay in politics very long. So that probably was how they punished him. But all over America, it was Alabama wants white people. Georgia wants white people. New York wants white people. Tulsa, Oklahoma, all over the place. Everybody wanted whites. And there were a few occasions where, like Tulsa and Greenwood, and lots of places where blacks flourished, and they had areas where they were thriving. Good black businesses. I remember it. I don't know if anybody on the call remembers, but I remember when Atlantic City was all black, and it was a pleasure to go to Atlantic City. But anyway, I digress. But if you notice, all these places where blacks thrived were burned down and burned out. And that sent a signal to blacks that if you don't want to be burned out, if you don't want to be lynched, then you better know your place and don't aspire any higher than you already are. And that kept a lot of people from wanting to do things. And getting on lynching, I just want you to understand, for those of you who don't know, that contrary to popular belief, lynching was focused. It really wasn't widespread to the point where they lynched just anybody. The majority of the people who were lynched in America were the prosperous people. The majority of the people who were lynched were the educated ones, the ones who owned property, who were in business, those who were educated, who wanted to do something, wanted to bring themselves up, because they were the threats. The majority of the people who were lynched were the ones who talked back and didn't abide by the Jim Crow laws of, if you walk on the same side of the street with a white person, you either have to look down or cross over. They were tired of being stressed out. Just imagine how stressful life for them was. My life in my time is super stressful because of racism. I cannot imagine what they went through. But all of these contribute to poor health outcomes because you're constantly living under a threat of death. You're constantly not being able to realize your dream. You're constantly saying, why do you hate me so much? You're constantly trying to explain to your children why they can't have this, to explain to your children why they can't go to certain places. I remember even in my lifetime, my mother telling me things that I realized later in life, she was trying to tell me not to get lynched. She used to say to me, don't let white people know that you drive a Mercedes. Don't ever bring anybody to your house. Don't talk about what you have. I never understood that, but I got my ass kicked constantly on the job. I was in corporate America, and the further up I went, the more I got beat down. That was lynching. I was a threat. Now, my two sisters, on the other hand, fell in line, and they didn't aspire to do anything that they wanted to do, and they didn't get as hurt as I was. They weren't lynched as frequently as I was. So that's the way that they were trying to tell us, and the way that they grew up. And it's really a sad situation. But because the government sanctioned these sort of activities, and the redlining, where the government said, well, two black people live in this area, so we're going to just totally color this whole area red, which means banks and insurance companies, you should not invest in these areas. And that's really, really sad. So the black people who lived there in these areas, not only could they not buy property, you could not borrow money to fix up the properties that you bought. So the areas where you lived were in constant disrepair, and they became worse and worse and worse and worse. And to this day, it's very difficult for someone who owns property in the quote unquote redlined areas to get a bank loan, because they don't give you the money. They don't underwrite you based upon your credit worthiness. They underwrite the neighborhood. And that is totally, totally wrong. Loan applications always rejected. Job applications always rejected. Mortgage applications always rejected. Rejection, rejection, rejection. Think about the stress that all this puts on people. So the question is, well, if you can't live in the suburbs, and I don't know if you remember, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, President Trump had a speech to white women in the suburbs, and he says he wants to save the suburbs. When I heard that speech, I thought, my God, this is what they did. If you do research and you read the old newspapers, they were all focused on white people, white buyers. Black people are moving in, and therefore we're going to sell our house. Or this is for white people only. Veterans need not apply. Black people better not come here because we got these barricades. Do not enter, detour, go another way. So the question is, where can they live? Well, The slums and the ghettos vacated by the Europeans, as I said, were widely open and available in disrepair from the beginning. And then there were the new plantations. You know what they were? They were the housing projects. They were prisons without bars. Just imagine, I'm sure everyone here must have seen, if not in person, a picture of a housing project. Thousands of Black people housed in high rise buildings, which gave rise to nothing but despair, mental issues, crime. There was child abuse, spousal abuse, alcohol abuse, drug addiction, everything imaginable, because you're warehoused in a situation where you're stuck. Just totally, I know of generations, two generations of people never getting out of this situation. Prospects of jobs, totally not there. The ability to get any sort of remedy for someone stealing something from you, just not there. Um, uh, because you call the police and they're not coming. So just imagine that. I mean, I live through this right now. You call the police on someone and they just don't come because you're not important. Um, uh, and it's just drives me crazy because I'm not important for the police to come. And people often say, this black on black crime, these people, they're savages. They tear up where they live and they kill each other. Well, every Sunday we would have dinner in our dining room and we invite our family to political discussions. I find it very strange that a lot of white people don't think that we ever had dining rooms, but we did. And I remember we were arguing one day about, why is there so much black on black crime? And all of us had an opinion. And my Uncle Bob was sitting in the chair, fifth grade education, a little bit too much to drink. And he says, all of y'all don't get the point. He says, you don't understand. Let me explain to you why there's so much black on black crime. He says, if a black person robs, kills, maims, rapes a white person, they will be hunted down like a wild animal and put under the jail, not in the jail. But if a black person robs a black person, ain't nobody coming. So if you were a robber, it's better for you to rob a black person because you know the police ain't coming. You would not dare rob a white person because you know you're going to get chased down. Now, this is not to say that there isn't any black on white crime, but this is to say that the statistics don't match reality. There is more black on black crime than black on white crime. And a lot of these rapes and other situations are exaggerated. For example, we all know about the various women who have claimed rape or kidnapping or whatever, and they always blame it on the black guy. Or if a white person wants to commit a crime, they always come to the black community. They want to dump a car and claim that to the insurance company that somebody stole it. They drive it to the black community and they tell them that somebody's black hijacked them. This is what society believes. So it's not really what you think. And I said to myself for the first time, Uncle Bob was right. And let me give you an example of why he was right. Two times in my life, he proved me right. We had a restaurant once on Albany Avenue, and there were two black guys fighting in the alley next to where we were. I grabbed the phone and I called the police. And my mother hears me explaining this long dissertation to the police about why they should come. She grabs the phone from me and says, white woman beaten up by black man. I swear to God, before we put the phone down, the police were there. Second time happened 2 years ago. My husband and I were driving on Enfield Street in Hartford, which is notoriously known for drug addicts and meth addicts and whatever addicts. And we saw these black guys carry this white guy to a car. And I thought the white guy was dead. So I called 911 and I said, there is this guy who's being carried to a car and I think he's dead. The dispatcher on the phone is telling me there's nothing she can do and blah, blah, blah. And there's no police, blah, blah, blah. My husband picks up the phone, takes it out of my hand. He says, black dude carrying white dude. I think they've killed him. I swear to God, around the corner comes a fire truck. This is just to explain to you that police don't come when black people call because our issues are not important enough. So just imagine that the statistics are just totally flawed when we talk about so much of this crime and how we're doing all this to white people. That's not true. It's the criminals doing what they need to do to the people where they get the least punishment. Now, if it were white people where they get the least punishment, that's who would be robbed. But right now, it's us. So once again, I'm talking about all the stressors that we live with, knowing that I am more at risk in my own neighborhood than a white person because the people who would rob me will never be hunted down. Think about how I feel about that. And these projects where thousands of people are warehoused together, just imagine what the hell they go through with substandard inside conditions, substandard outside conditions. And it is a fact that the federal government knew about the dangers of lead, and all these housing projects, lead was everywhere, inside, outside, playgrounds, everywhere. All the railings, lead exposure was everywhere. And you wonder why so many children are lead exposed to lead. Now, it's true that 70% of the housing projects in the United States, 70% of the housing projects in the United States are located within 1 mile of a Superfund site, which contributes to poor health outcomes, which interfere with jobs and education. Can you imagine? 70% of the housing projects in America are located within 1 mile of a Superfund site. Now, our movement is called the environmental justice movement, but I like to call it the environmental injustice movement because our movement brings to light the fact that low income whites and people of color of all incomes, actually Blacks of all incomes, shoulder the burdens, but not the benefits of environmental exposures. And that there is a disproportionate share of the bad air, the poor water quality, and contaminated lands. Disproportionate share of all these negative consequences of environmental degradation based purely on where we live, where we work, where we play, and when we pray. Think about it. Who gets the worst jobs? Who has the worst and the more dangerous occupations? Black people. Who's the first, last hired and first fired? Black people. All of these things contribute to poor outcomes where no other race is exposed to that. So who lives in an environmental justice community? Low income whites, remember. And a lot of people don't realize it. It's low income whites live in environmental justice communities as well. Latinx people, Blacks of any income, because race, not class, is the determining factor of where environmental injustices occur. So if race is the determining factor, you wonder why there are so many diseases that are attributed to African Americans in America. It's not necessarily hereditary. It could be that we're all exposed to some very harmful, toxic, life-altering exposures. Now, let me describe for you what an environmental justice community looks like. Because for the most part, people think that environmental justice communities are full of sewage treatment plants and landfills, incinerators, chemical plants, refineries, bus depots, power plants. But in reality, not all EJ communities have all these things. But what they all do have is dry cleaners, auto repair shops. They have all sorts of polluting industries. They have bus lines running past their houses and stopping in front of where they live. So they're exposed to all this diesel exhaust and the particulate matter that comes with diesel exhaust, which is nothing but soot, which dangers their cardiovascular system. What they all do have is the proximity to highways and other transportation hubs. So imagine living and being assaulted on a daily basis by all of this pollution. And you wonder why there's so much asthma. There's so many various types of cancers, why lead poisoning is so common, why there's low birth weight babies, why there are all kinds of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, obesity. These two things a lot of people don't realize, but diabetes and obesity, it has been proven and several studies have shown are related to poor air quality. Imagine that. And we all know that in African American community, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, all related to poor air quality. Cognitive issues. Lots of African American children are in special ed classes. They can't concentrate. They can't think. because they're exposed to so many chemicals that alter their brains and change their ability to learn. Just think about asthma. The number one cause for school absenteeism is asthma. And don't just stop at the child. Think about it. If your mother or your father or both has to take you to the hospital, they're taking the whole family to the hospital. And we all know how many hours we have to wait in the emergency room these days, sometimes 13, 14 hours. So you, the patient, and your brothers and sisters have to go with you. None of you are ready to go to school the next day. And the child who's the asthmatic is not leaving the house, but your sisters and brothers have to go and they're sleeping in class. They're not concentrating. So every incident that you have, they also suffer because they don't learn either. So what does this lack of learning lead to? More stress, much more stress. And these children typically drop out of school early. They become the bullies of the class. They become marked. Teachers put remarks in their records that carry them through high school. They don't stand a chance. And with all the technology that we have today, there should be no reason for asthmatics to lose a day of learning because prior to COVID-19, there were ways that children could learn online at home, but the asthmatics were never ever given that opportunity. And speaking about COVID-19, why do you think the African American community is so hit hard? I used to marvel at the fact that in the beginning, the television people used to say, well, I wonder why Black people are getting it so much. Well, if you think about all the pre-existing conditions that are ripe for COVID-19, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to realize that if you already have respiratory illnesses and you already have diabetes, and if you already have high blood pressure, and if you're already obese, and if you already have the conditions that COVID-19 just love, well, naturally, you're going to get COVID-19 first, hardest, and longest. And if you realize too that the majority of the essential workers are Black people and people of color who are not only working in those nursing homes, but they're also the bus drivers, they're the Lyft drivers, they're the Uber drivers, they work for Instacart. They're out there shopping for you to keep you safe because they have no choice. No wonder. And then think also too about the folks who live in multi-generational families. A lot of people have mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, sometimes aunts and uncle. It's amazing how many people live together, multiple generations, because they can't afford to live anywhere else. So all of this is stress. All of this adds to poor health outcomes. And if you can just imagine living where all this pollution is, uh, you have to live in it to understand it. Sewage sludge plants. I'll give you a basic example of one of those. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, there's P.T. Barnum Housing Complex. Several years ago, maybe 20 or 30, a young boy named Gary Crooks went missing one day. Couldn't find him. When they finally found him, he was at the bottom of a sewage sludge pool. He thought it was a swimming pool, and he jumped in and got caught up. The plant was 500 feet from his front door. Outrageous. And that
Wow, Sharon.
situation still exists in Bridgeport, Connecticut right now. In fact, Bridgeport, Connecticut is a textbook case of health disparities and all kinds of adverse health conditions because P.T. Barnum, in and of itself, is right off of 95, where the highway is, where all the diesel exhaust, where all the old lead exposure keeps coming up because lead is persistent. Then, in addition to that, there is Wheelabrator Incinerator within walking distance from P.T. Barnum. Then you have the Bridgeport Harbor Power Plant within walking distance of P.T. Barnum. Then you have numerous other industries right next to P.T. Barnum. Everybody there is sick with one type of illness or another, ranging from cancer. Everybody has asthma. Nobody can breathe. It's simply outrageous. And yet this is continued to be allowed to happen. And Bridgeport, Connecticut, in and of itself, was a major player in the Industrial Revolution. So in my opinion, there's not a single spot of uncontaminated land in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Bridgeport was famous during the Industrial Revolution. Lots of new inventions were invented here. Lots of industry was here. And lots of contaminated soil is still in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And as you might well know, the people who live on top of all this contaminated land are Black people for the most part, and now people of color who are not necessarily Black. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that when you think about the origins of all these illnesses, think about how where people live is killing them. Their neighborhoods are killing them. Their jobs are killing them. So I'm going to stop right now because I don't want to go over my time, but I want to end by saying that the United States medical system is responsible for all of this. And it's not just the health disparities, but our system is still haunted by slavery, the horrors that were done to the slaves in the name of experimentation and distrust. You know, we all know about the Tuskegee Institute uh, 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 example, where for 40 years, these Black men were given syphilis and were not treated so that they could study the effects of syphilis. 40 years. And then you think about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells still contribute to major advances and all types of cures, including cancer, and yet her own children cannot afford good medical care. And these are just two examples that have risen to the top. But there are numerous other examples of Black people being used for experiments. Dr. Sims, for example, a famous gynecologist, used to uh, experiment on slaves without anesthesia, doing operations without any type of uh, uh, a system where they would not feel any pain. In fact, to this day, we've all read studies about how doctors to this day believe that Black people have a higher tolerance for pain and therefore will not give us pain meds. I personally experienced that. And I have a very good white friend who has given me all the meds that I needed for uh, my joint replacement and my knee replacement because my doctors wouldn't give it to me, but she got anything she wanted. And every time she saw me, she'd hand me some pills because she knew I couldn't get what I needed. But these are all old, archaic, racist beliefs about African Americans. How dare you say that we feel pain differently? How dare you say that I don't deserve to feel some type of relief from pain because I'm Black, but you can give my white friend all the narcotics she needs so that she can sleep at night, but I can't. So I would just end by saying that America has a lot to atone for, and we need to start talking about it, and we need to acknowledge it and move on. Thank you.